Any comment, question, reaction? Betsy?
Hi, I'm from the Citizens Budget Commission, and we've looked at some of the defined contribution options and the hybrid combinations around in different states. It seems as though the SUNY ORBS plan or the state university systems traditionally use this form more than, let's say traditional public sector employers. And I'm wondering what you think of the competitiveness of the governor's Tier 6 proposal as it relates to the attractiveness to, professors coming in. Is it low when you look at the other systems? How do you sort of rate the competitive attractiveness of the DC changes proposed in Tier 6?
Well, I think that the attractiveness of having a defined contribution option is very high. I think, as we've heard a lot today, there's a lot of features to a defined contribution plan that will be very attractive to potential employees and will be a very big recruitment tool that we can use to help attract and retain qualified employees. I think we've heard that there's some industry logic around potential contribution rates being optional. Which percentages of those are employer versus employee is certainly flexible, but I think that we feel that it does need to be designed in a way that would continue to be a good recruitment and retention tool. But I think that beyond just the rate, it's important to look at the functions and features of a defined contribution plan as a big bonus to potential employees due to its flexibility.
Is there like a typical range of other systems? Is it 10? Is it 11? How would a 6 or an 8 compare with?
It varies. Probably generally the average, at least among higher education systems, is somewhere between 8 and 10% employer contribution and between 3 and 6% employee contribution, generally for a total between 12 and 15%. But again, it's important to take into account all sources of income when you're working with employees to plan their income, including Social Security as well.
I'd like to chime in on that. I mean, I think it's clear that the governor's, if you impose the governor's plan on SUNY and CUNY in particular now, it would be inadequate and non-competitive. There's a reason why the higher ed plans tend to have these contribution rates that total in the 12 to 15% range. Because, referring to the myth Peter mentioned earlier, that's explained in the report, they were intended to be primary pensions. If you're going to have a defined contribution plan that is intended to be someone's primary pension, the savings rate can't be 4%. The true cost of defined benefit pensions is nowhere near 4%. It's much, much higher. Even in the plan the governor has proposed, even by the fallacious accounting standards of public pension systems, the full cost of Tier 6 would be 10 or 11% combined employer-employee. And that's real lowball and, as I said, arguably fallacious. So I do think that you've got to be in the ballpark with the higher ed systems, just for starters, you need to be in that range. And I think also, in order to credibly propose a plan as a pension alternative, a true pension alternative, you need to have a savings rate that is more like 12, if not more, combined. And if you make the supplemental voluntary aided option attractive enough, you'll get anybody who's thinking at all about their retirement will readily put into it. And I don't think we should be scared off by that and say, well, no, that's too expensive. We're looking to get cheap, cheap, cheap. I think the benefit of transparency and predictability is very, very valuable. And I think that people running school districts and municipalities would readily agree that they would trade predictability and transparency for some assurance that 15 years from now, if all goes well, your average is going to go down to 4%. I think they've learned the lesson of the phony zero rates of the late 90s and would rather not be shackled to something like that and have the benefits that would come with it. So I do think that SUNY and CUNY in particular, but not limited to them, would need to be more than the 4% minimum.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Morrow, you mentioned personal one-on-one financial advice that's offered to members of the ORBS plan. Can you talk about how much that costs? How many people are they employed by TIAA-CREF? Are they contracted out? And I don't believe that's included in the governor's proposal. Am I correct in that?
The governor's proposal is silent on a lot of plan design issues. and that's frequently left to the administration of the plan. We have a very large plan. In fact, it's the largest public defined contribution system in the country. We have very large economy of scale abilities through that arrangement. And again, we've worked very hard with our business partners to design a system that is at the leading edge of industry logic and thought as far as the types of services that need to be incorporated in design. And as I mentioned earlier, it's vitally important that our employees have the ability to make and manage a successful pension, which can be very complicated. If anyone has a 401k or is in the state 457 plan, you know that there's investment options, asset classes, there's a lot of things you have to think about. Generally, there would be a fee associated for employees to contract with the financial planner on their own, or fees would be increased at the plan level to accommodate that. What we have done is we've worked this in through the plan level so that there's no additional cost to employees to take advantage of these services. It's worked in as a component of the fees charged against participant earnings on their account in a transparent manner. But the actual cost for these services is very, very low because of the partnerships we've received from our investment providers and the economies of scale for having such a large scale plan. Thanks.
It's actually, I would note that if you go to the Brightscope site, which is a totally independent rater of 401ks, the place where the SUNY and CUNY plans are highly rated is in terms of their overall costs, which includes the administrative costs. Now again, that doesn't mean all this is flawless. If you really go at this seriously, over time, you could quickly implement a plan just like the SUNY and CUNY plan, but then to manage it well over time, you got to keep looking closely at cost and at fees and at fair pricing of investment options. But it's not, there are economies of scale, obviously. It's a really big system. And any system that was open to all state and local employees in the future would also be a really big system. And so that I think that the cost would not be really, I don't think, significant. I think, and the question of whether you structured a system ultimately to even take some of those costs and somehow segregate them and have the employer eat them in some sort of arrangement with plan providers is a whole other issue. But it would not be, it wouldn't involve some significant appropriation. I mean, not in the context of human resources in the state budget or even a local budget.
What we found is given our design, our size, and the economies of scale and partnerships we've established, we're actually able to provide significantly higher level of service than many other employers at a far lower cost.
I'd like to add the point also that the current system we have, the current retirement system we have, there's an administrative cost to that is billed directly to state and local government employers. I believe in the current year for the state retirement system, ERS and PFRS, it's $114 million. So, you know, however it's done, there is going to be a cost, and we currently do have a cost to administer the existing system.
Ma'am in the back? No. This lady behind you was first, I'm sorry.
So aside from cost, I mean, it sounds kind of complicated to set up. How long do you think it would take for a system like ERS to set up a DC?
Designing a plan, a defined contribution plan properly can take a fair amount of time and work up front. It can take between 6 months and a year or more. Obviously, there's a variety of services and support that one can bring to bear. We have a lot of experts here in the state of New York, as well as a lot of industry-leading experts who are located either right within New York or quite close in proximity that can help design these plans. It is a lot of work to put it together, but it's important that it be done right. And I think it's critical that the design components be well thought out in advance.
Sir, yes.
I wanted to ask Tim and Peter what their contribution rates were on average from 1989 to 2003 when you do your, this is what we contributed to what we contributed now.
I mean, the period when rates were very low?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was acknowledged that there was a time period where rates were virtually nothing. And I do want to also note, during that time period, we as an organization supported legislation that was never enacted that would allow us to put money away in a reserve fund, local governments put money away in a reserve fund for the day, the day of reckoning that we knew was coming when rates, no, we did not have the authority to do that, to put it in a reserve fund, a lockbox, to prepare for that day.
School boards did.
No, they didn't.
Our school district did.
For people who in the ERS plan, we do have a reserve capability. Until recently, we had no reserve capability to put money away for the TRS
The
retirees.
point is that for 20 years, you underfunded the system. And now you want to cut the benefits to the employees because you didn't fund the system at the 8% that EJ suggests. Had you done 8% on average in those years, what would be your contribution rate today?
Well, the system was not underfunded. The system was funded, in fact, it's a conservatively funded system compared to others. It was fully funded throughout that
The
period.
contribution rate, EJ, was 2% or less for 10 years for employees.
That was what the system required then, because of
I
its
got
investment
that,
returns.
but that has led to your higher rates
It
today.
has not led to your higher rates today. Absolutely has not.
What
No.
evidence do you have of that, EJ?
No, that's a fact. Ask the
It's not a
actuaries in the
fact.
system.
It's not a fact, the
The-
controller disagrees with you on that.
No, the controller proposed a different plan that involves borrowing from the fund and then paying it back and justifying it on the grounds that you'd have a new higher floor. But during the reason the funds became underfunded and required higher contributions in the 2000s is not because they were underfunded in the 90s. They weren't underfunded. What happens is their expenses went up.
8% in the 90s, what would be the average rate today?
What would have happened was politically, because we do live in the real world, is that it would be a version of what happened then, was that when a big fat $50 to $80 billion surplus appeared in the fund, it would be spent. Which is what happened even when it wasn't there. That's what happened.
What happened is, for a long period of time, employers paid nothing into the system. And that has led to the higher rates, along with the decline in the stock market. Brought about by,
That wasn't our choice. That's part of the problem here. As an employer, we just get the bill. All we got to do is just pay the contribution rate, whatever we're not looking to pay a higher rate than is expected of us. We many times tried to lobby the legislature to not allow all these sweeteners to take place. We wanted to have a reserve fund for the TRS so we could put money aside when the day came. Those things were not available to us. All we could do is pay the bill. And when the bill was less than 2%, you're right. Here's what also happened. We ended up hiring a lot of employees because they were cheap. You could pay a salary, and the benefits on top of that weren't going to cost you that much. And indeed, today, we're paying the piper, and a lot of those people are getting laid off. It's really been a tragedy.
and the last question I had is, what would be the impact of moving a large sum of money out of the traditional retirement system into a defined contribution system on the traditional retirement system that we currently have?
Because the systems, in both cases, we're talking now about the state ERS and the state TRS, are by their own accounting standards and by their actuarial standards, quote, fully funded, unquote. The impact on tiers 1 through 5 would be 0. The impact on tier 6 would be potential in the sense that if you have a TRS, for instance, let's take the case of the teacher's retirement system. So you're getting at an argument, I think it's a good question. There would not be an impact on the established systems and on any established pensioner member of the systems. Remember, to be fully funded means that as of right now, they have every penny they need to meet every obligation they have right now. You're not taking money out. The question is, in the extreme, let's say you offered a good defined contribution plan, and that 20% of the teachers over time, on average, of the newly average teachers, 20 to 40% of them, make it even a larger percent, said, I want the defined contribution plan instead. You'd have two countervailing pressures. A large number, you heard about the turnover rates, 35%, say, on average in the first 5 years. A large number of people who normally, who the systems make money off of because they don't pay them a fair benefit, would be taking the money with themselves. Others would be people who would be in the plan anyway, who are simply paying for a different plan. To the extent that it changed the actuarial assumptions of Tier 6, it would mean that the Tier 6 normal contribution assumption, instead of being about 4%, if you had a significant erosion over time, under the aggregate funding method, the required contribution would go from 4 to maybe 6 or 7. But as long as you have an aggregate funding method like they do, and employers are required, as they are by Court of Appeals decisions, to pay their required contribution every single year, the answer is basically boils down to there would be no problem.
So the controller disagrees with that analysis as well.
I believe
So-
I disagree with him.
Okay, but the controller has a different point of view. The last point the last point I wanted to.
I do want to hear your last point, but I don't want to let that last comment go, because our association, I as the executive director, sit on the Controller's Retirement System Advisory Council. We just met 2 weeks ago. It's the employer associations, the employee associations. The question you raised, which is a good question, was put to the head of the retirement system. He said, I don't know if EJ was in the back of the room and I didn't know it, he said essentially what EJ just said, that in the short term, there is no anticipated effect, and going forward, there may be, but the significance of it, they don't anticipate.
The effect would be on the required contribution for the people in the Tier 6 plan, who are counterparts to the Tier 6 defined contribution members.
And the last question I had is this really first off, do you guys support EJ's proposal to raise your contribution rates for a defined contribution plan in order for it to provide adequate retirement savings?
I would say that our members would trade this, I believe they would trade the 7% maximum under the governor's plan for the 8% maximum under what EJ recommended in order to get a DC option and the stability of a DC option. To know it's 8% and it's going to stay there.
It's 8 to 10 under EJ's.
No, it's not. It's 6
to
to 8 for local, for employers.
But if it was more, frankly, if this discussion right now in Albany was not, no, DC bad, no. If the discussion instead was, wait a minute, 4, are you kidding? Let's make it 12, let's make it 14. That would be a good discussion. But that's not the discussion we're having, unfortunately. But I think that's the discussion we ought to be having. So I'm glad the question's coming up.